And now we continue with our discussion. I would like to invite to the stage Madina, to return Madina Tlostanova. I invite Misho Antadze, whose film we just saw, and Kateryna Botanova, Ukrainian art critic, who was here yesterday on stage, and as a moderator, and today as a speaker. I think it was a really good idea to shift screening of this film to today, because I think it's an illustration to what Madina was speaking. When decoloniality brings us outside this anthropological point of view, and we look at other species, at other lives, at other types of existence, and what happens to them because of human activities. Yeah, because decoloniality, I think, is a way to overcome the results of the activities of mankind. And I think it also is an important thing to see that decoloniality can also be fun. And with a little bit of humor, you can talk about different and difficult topics and show it in unexpected ways. Thank you so much. It was a beautiful work.
Thank you.
My first reflection would be, and a question to all of you, is actually about the general title of the whole program. The whole program that will last throughout this fall is called Decolonising Art Beyond the Obvious. And in this name, we have two parts. We are speaking about decoloniality and art, of course, but also the terms beyond and obvious. And the word beyond, actually, I took from the work of Homi Bhabha, The Location of Culture, and actually he starts this book with this sentence that it is a trope of our times to locate the question of culture in the realm of the beyond. And I think that the word beyond here both can refer to decoloniality as such, but also to the place of art and culture, which is often seen as something different, something that you have to treat separately, something that beyond politics, something that kind of has to be treated on other principles. And I would like to point out here the kind of difficulty of accepting the notion of suspending Russian culture that this movement, this kind of campaign started after 24th of February and actually intended to bring awareness that Russian culture is imperial as well. And while the Russian troops invading Ukraine, Russian culture should not be presented in the major places, actually not in major, in any kind of places. So it should not have a voice. And it is quite difficult, actually, to explain to anyone in West, South, North, elsewhere, that Tchaikovsky is imperialist, that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were imperialists, that Fabergé acts even are part of imperial culture. Why do you think this beyond goes so far that sometimes we can't explain the particular local situation of decoloniality to the whole world? So like we are staying with this issue just ourselves, unable to kind of explain this to anyone. Yeah, you have a mic.
I have a mic.
Start.
Where to start? I mean, it's kind of a lot, right? I think one of the things that's kind of obvious, that became very obvious to me as an artist from Georgia, as an artist from Eastern Europe, as soon as I have gone to the West and started studying in Los Angeles. I think it was my first homework assignment. You know, there was just I had this rather terrible teacher who gave us some rather terrible assignments. I made up some rather terrible video, as it happens, and I show it, and it doesn't really mean anything, right? And she watches it, and with a very solemn face, she looks at me and she tells me, I know what this is about, and I know what your art is about. And I'm like, oh wow, great, like first year of art school, I already have it figured out. And she looks at me and she tells me that like, this is about you being from one place and living in another place. And this is about how no one out here in the West can really understand you. And it wasn't about that. But as years pass, I kind of hate to admit that maybe she, in a way, that she was right, because this is the lens through which we are looked at, and this is a lens through which we are also looked at when it comes to dealing with our own imperial past. In my case, it's the Georgian imperial past. In Saturn's case, it's a whole different kind of colonial experience. But it is kind of, I suppose, a matter of how we are read. And it's quite kind of unfortunate that it didn't take just one war, but it took a war that became much more visible optically. And really, like on television, it became much more kind of mediated, that we are being taken seriously, because I hope we are, because the wounds run much, much deeper, and the wounds inflicted on our cultures, on our ways of making things, it's something like explaining that Russian culture is imperialist will never undo these wounds. But it's a good start, and it's a good start. You know, I mean, I think it's kind of wrong to say that, you know, like we demand that like Russian culture becomes invisible. No, actually, I think we're asking for the opposite. We want Russian culture to be seen for what it actually is. An imperial culture that always talked about us, that we never had a chance to talk back to. And I think this is what we are doing. That makes sense.
I believe that the whole talk yesterday was mostly dedicated to trying to look from different perspectives, from different positions to why we are where we are now, why Ukraine fall into this beyond. But what I believe is maybe even more important today is try to look and to think, you know, how do we deal with it, you know, from now on? I mean, as of February 24th, but also from now on, what do we do with this beyond? And I think it's very important that what different actors, specifically cultural actors, have been doing for this half year is insisting in different forms and different ways on the very simple thing, nothing about us without us. And I'm afraid that this is the work we'll be doing for a long time now. Most of us are quite tired, but that's the only way. And there are different parts of this work and different parts on this path. And you know, one of them is, of course, political and geopolitical. You know, nothing about the future of the country and of its people made without really listening and looking into the wish of these people, into the struggle of these people. But another one, and it's a part of maybe of what we are doing here, is also maybe helping our potential colleagues and friends, also decolonial thinkers, to also arrive at this notion that nothing, about us without us. And I've seen it and I've heard it many times before February, but very many times after February, when with the best intention and with some theoretical background knowledge, thinkers and artists would start talking about Ukrainian art and culture on an extremely superficial level. The good thing is that, okay, ticking the box and saying, now we have to talk about Ukraine because this is happening, we just cannot look over it. This is great. But wouldn't it be more great to take an honest position and say, well, we don't know it. We have been overlooking this whole story for such a long time, so instead of talking about it, I would not talk about it, but I would give the floor to the person or to people who actually know and can talk about it. We will not, I had a wonderful example. It was a conference in Paris a couple of months ago. And the French philosopher and researcher literally said, I found this Instagram account of a Ukrainian artist, and it's wonderful. I don't know this guy, I don't even know his real name, but let's analyze the Instagram account. So ticking the box is great, but actually decolonizing the decolonizers can be one of the, not easy, but wonderful tasks of reaching to this beyond and, listening to the voice of people, of artists, of the critics, of cultural actors from those localities. It sounds very simple and, you were talking about it today, but again, on theoretical level, does it happen on practical level today? Not really, or not yet where this voice would be really heard and taken as a serious one. Not just a traumatized one, not just one in pain, not just an emotional one, and by this kind of dismissed, like, yeah, guys, we know you're suffering. Okay, next one. But as a powerful vision and also a process, because it's not just the position, right? Also, things that are happening in Ukrainian kind of arts and culture in the last half year are immense. It's everyday changing self-reflection and self-understanding. But if we sort of widen that perspective and put it in the 8 years perspective, as of annexation of Crimea and the beginning of war on Donbass, the changes in self-understanding and self-appreciation and literally becoming local and connected to where we are from and what does it mean for cultural actors in Ukraine has been tremendous. And I think that's one of the main changes and one of the main sort of epistemological justices that we are doing to ourselves now, and I hope we'll be doing for quite some time. But yeah, it's a very, very long way.
Yeah, it's amazing listening to you all, and of course I agree with you, but I was also thinking, about other examples like the Zapatistas, for instance, right, that also insisted on similar things and used to say, like, yeah, it's a revolution of dignity also, in that sense, it rhymes with the Ukrainian case. And yeah, it has to be about us making decisions, us coming up with ideas, and but at the same time I was thinking, is it possible to change this perspective in the West, for instance, that is not interested in learning, right? This kind of triumphant ignorance and homogenizing of all cultures. So it's a lot of work, and it has to be, I think, more forceful maybe than it is now, because it's so easy to slide into these colonialist tropes of this orientalization, exoticization, homogenization, not seeing the differences. And I was also thinking that it's important, of course, for the Ukrainian art and for Ukrainian activists and for Ukrainians in general, because it's much more than, it's much bigger than art, of course. But it's also, important when you mention the cancellation, the so-called cancellation of the Russian culture. The Russian culture needs to be decolonized, and they need to work on that, rather than coming up with this kind of ready-made canons and not wanting to change anything in them. But this is the hardest thing, because the Russian Empire and the Russian artists today, they don't see themselves like that, right? There is no critical element there, and never was. And I always give this one small example, like of my Indian friend and retired professor who wrote one of the first books questioning Russian Orientalism and colonialism in relation to the Caucasus and Central Asia using the archival materials. And the book was never published in Russian because nobody wanted to question Pushkin or, you know, Lermontov or Tolstoy, as you said, right? And seeing this imperialist element. So they have a much more difficult task in front of them, because I think Ukrainians, they're already doing this, and they, I mean, they realize what they do. They have a very clear goal, and it's already visible. It's already becoming visible. But with Russian culture, it's like it hasn't even started, and I don't know if it can. So.
From your talk, I received one of the questions to our one of the answers to our questions on how do we decolonize art, is that actually it can never happen fully. Yeah, so this is the process that just lasts, and so decoloniality is not theory, but it's a practice, it's an approach, and it's a constant process. But where is it actually taking us? What is this decolonial utopia where we want to be when we are at least halfway? And I imagine that some people might not want to decolonize, or institutions or a context. What should make people want to decolonize?
Theory or in practice?
In practice.
You know, I remember, I think it was 3 years ago, the last sort of pre-pandemic and the pre-war Congress of Culture. It's an important event in Ukraine, which happens in Lviv. Happened, I think, 3 times already, which basically intends into what the name is there, to gather cultural actors from different parts of the country and sort of think together about where we are and what's next, where we're moving. And we had this panel on cultural policies, and everybody was super pessimistic about, like, things are like not really good. And I don't know, maybe that's a bit of a privilege of me being partially outsider, because I don't live in Ukraine since 5.5 years now. But I was saying, guys, let's look where we've been in 2010 or in 2012 and where we are now. Isn't it important to see this tremendous inner work and change that, you know, we produced? And maybe from that point we still critically reflect on where we are, and then we can move forward. I think what we really need in a Ukrainian context is also be aware of how far we moved from, let's say, end of 2000s. You know, Tanya and I just had a talk recently, and we were remembering our artistic curatorial practices at the end of the 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010, how we were inviting Russian curators for lecturing. They were mentoring us and our peers and our colleagues on how to do things properly. Well, I didn't, but a lot of also our colleagues went to Moscow to participate in curatorial summer schools, you know, in readings. And then annexation of Crimea came, and beginning of the war in Donbass, and all of a sudden those things became impossible. But first it was politically impossible, and then so it was not an inner choice, it was something which came from outside. And then those people that we were inviting for lecturing, and that we respected at certain people who have something that we didn't, they started to speak out or not to speak out, and through their public position became clear, well, maybe we actually don't want to work with them anymore. And then came the process of asking ourselves, okay, why did we even want to work with them in the first place? What can we do without them? What does it mean, stop looking eastwards or northeastwards, for certain, cultural canon. Why did we do it before? Why didn't we ask those questions? And then everything which happened, after Maidan was a very long and sometimes painful process of finding who we are. And I really think it's quite crucial that the different paths that Russian art, visual art in particular, but not only, and Ukrainian art took, actually before Maidan, also at the end of the zeros, when in the Russian scene there was a presence of big capital, and the big capital literally dictated what could happen. So you could have a big institutions and big, you had Moscow Biennale, you would invite Western curators to also come and do cool things, and you had Perm, you had, all these grand narratives. And Ukraine didn't have it. Well, there was and still is Pinchuk Art Center, but to the credit of Pinchuk Art Center, at a certain moment, also after Maidan, they realized that, well, we don't want to be this artificial project. We actually need to connect and research of what is here. Why are we here in Ukraine, in Kiev? What are those artists? But other than that, there was never big money. So what was happening in Ukrainian art, and which sort of became more of a conscious choice and gesture after Maidan, was the grassroots collaborative practices of self-care, of solidarity, of linking the different parts of histories and country together, of going and working, trying to understand and meet, East and West and North and South, and realize, okay, we didn't do it enough before, but we want to do it now. Let's meet each other, let's know each other. And this is a powerful gesture of decolonizing ourselves, finding our own voice and trusting it, and also seeing it again as a process. It's not something fixed. It's moving and changing, and different parts of knowledge are being acquired or become sort of more present, or certain parts of knowledge become more obsolete. And I think we should just be aware of that work. From that, we will see the futures. I actually like this multiple possibilities, this plural form of the word futures, because it's not one, it's many, and we're choosing it in each given position, and then it sort of shows something else for us.
What you just said reminded me about the words, the famous words of Ukraine's famous writer Mykola Khvelyovy, who in 1920s, 100 years ago, proclaimed his famous motto, "Away from Moscow, геть від Москви." And this was, I think, a powerful moment in the Ukrainian cultural renaissance of the 20s that was destroyed literally, physically. Hundreds of artists were executed, and the whole generation just burned in ashes, with archives, with memory, and we didn't know anything about them after they were all killed in Sandarmokh for decades. And only after the archives were opened again, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were able to learn that there was this cultural renaissance, and they wanted to get away from Moscow back 100 years ago. But for that wish, they were all exterminated physically. So we are like turning back to the point 100 years ago when we finally understand why we need to get away from Moscow and go elsewhere. Yeah.
In a very practical way, as a kind of a practicing artist, I think one of the answers to the question is so if we ask what is the aspiration of decoloniality, the first thing that I think of is that it's a very positive act. It has it's about the acquisition of knowledge in a kind of a non-colonial, non-imperial way, and the production of knowledge. In a kind of a way, I think this is what's very interesting to me as a Georgian artist who has, after moving to the West, engaged a lot with Ukrainian artists, how how little we know of each other's culture, yet how much we can recognize things in each other and recognize that a different kind of knowledge exists about us, that doesn't come from Moscow, the imperial metropole, or even the West, and how much of that can be shared with each other. The other thing, and I think it's kind of connects again to the story that I told about the teacher who kind of put me in this frame. Well, I guess one of the aspirations is to be able to make work that's not only subject to this colonial condition and not only subject to this imperial condition, to be able to go beyond that and to be able to talk more about that and kind of talk about more things than just the confines that history has created for us and put us in. And it's a process. And I think it's a permanent process and something that will constantly keep creeping back in. And it's something that during our last discussion I also brought up. I very often think of, like those very famous words of Walter Benjamin about that until the Redeemer comes, not even the dead will be safe from the Antichrist, and the Antichrist continues to be victorious. And in our terms, it really means that our histories are still subject to this kind of colonialized perspective. And then if you remember the rest of the words as something that only the historian can fan the flames that will save even the dead, etc., etc. I think the task is something similar. It's to both kind of retrieve the stolen past, which can never be retrieved and which will always be an incomplete process, and also to find these other futures in which we are free from this kind of a colonial condition. Thank you.
No.
Maybe I can share a short comment, because you talking about the solidarity and thinking about the region in a way. It reminded me another part of the colonial gaze which we're dealing with, and I was thinking about the connections and the exchange between the countries of former Soviet Union, and there was the program initiated by European Union in 2010. It was the first phase of Eastern Partnership Cultural Program. It had then second phase, and then it stopped, unfortunately. But it was an idea brought from the European Union about that you guys there in Eastern Partnership, we will call you now this, because, how else we call you post-Soviet, Eastern Partnership. You have to connect and know each other. You share a past, maybe you can also share a present. And it was wonderful, best intention. And I was also somehow a bit of part of it. I was doing the research that prepared the program, but I also remember the initial feelings of the partners when it was launched, and there was like one conference, another conference with participants, with cultural institutions from the 6 countries of the region, and the first motion was like, we don't want to be together. We've been together for too long. Get off. We have nothing in common. We don't want to share it. We have different futures. We want to forget about the past. And I was like, yeah, okay. And then time went on, and there were collaborative projects, there were things, travels, and by the end of the 3-year time of the first phase of the program, there was actually re-actualization, or like reopening to each other, like, yeah, we do have some past in common, and that makes us closer in sharing and understanding also our differences, but we have a lot of solidarity that can be there. But then the paradox is that the moment this realization happened, the money stopped. And that's the part of a colonial project also, because, the projects between Ukrainian, Georgian, Armenian, Moldavian, Belarusian, at that time it was possible, actors are only possible with certain support. I mean, as any cultural project, but also because of a distance, because of a travel. If there is no money, there is no project. And where this money can come from European Union, the money stopped. not all collaboration stopped, of course, but the scope was much different. So we also, I think, have to be aware what are we fighting for, and what kind of relations in the region we want to have, where they come from, and can we find the ways to sustain them, which is not easy.
No, I cannot agree more. We dealt with this in decolonial option and called it double coloniality, in the sense that there is this bad connection with the Russian Empire and its aftermath, but it's also the Western, the global coloniality. And then you're like in between the devil of Russia and the deep blue sea of this global coloniality that still frames you in certain ways and wants to see you as a victim or as somebody with no agency, right? Or somebody who uses the prescribed forms of acting and theorizing and making art and all that. And that's unfortunately, yeah, that's why I think it's important, yeah, to develop these transversal coalitions and go beyond and go bypassing this prescribed top-down sort of things that they are imposing on us on both ends. Yeah.
Question is how to do it, you know, if the economic background is, you know, the economic power is elsewhere. And this is, I think this is one of the big questions for, you know, many next discussions, you know, how do we build equal, honest, horizontal relation when the capital is elsewhere?
And actually, that was supposed to be my last question to all of you, and thank you for already kind of starting it. I wanted to ask all of you on artistic level, let's say institutional level, and academic theoretical level, what could be the practical steps? And I don't think that the only resource we need is capital. I think we can get resource from different other aspects and create these resources, find and create, as long as we know what we need to do and where it's going to take us. And yesterday we were talking briefly that this decolonization in the classical or more kind of usual way of this approach that relate to the Western empires, first of all, and their colonies, has moved forward, and there are approaches, there are instructions, there are guidelines, there are certain principles that are already there. They are already kind of accepted as rules, and you know, museums have guides on how they treat their collections in this term. Art institutions know, you know, how they should be treating this issue. But again, Ukraine and other countries that were part of the Russian Empire are not seen through that lens. So we're not in those guides. And this is why we're not treated through this decolonial approach. So one thing that could be done, is kind of also following up on the kind of guide, the list of principles, kind of policy on how you deal with this artistic heritage from former Russian Empire, USSR, etc. But what else can be done? What can be done, and what maybe is already being done in the terms of private individual artistic practices, institutions, and academia?
Last time we talked, it was at the invitation of this a really good friend of mine, Yulia. Yulia is a Ukrainian artist, Yulia Elias, who lives in Utrecht, who completely, after the full-scale invasion, suspended her practice, turned her studio given to her by HKU, the art institution. She turned the studio into a humanitarian point, etc. Just the amazing work. But she has also been doing amazing work for a very long time, which is that she has been, every time a Dutch institution would present Ukrainian artwork as kind of like, oh yeah, like the Russian collection, or like Russian artwork, or, you know, like showed Tsiga Vertov in like some Russian retrospective, she would email them and she would call them and she would demand to speak to them, and most of the times she would be ignored. And after the full-scale invasion, a couple of months in, she just followed up those emails. And she said, hello, remember, like, it's a pity I never heard back from you, etc. And all of them responded now. So, you know, I mean, I guess it's, you kind of have to use this position that we find ourselves in for this practical change. And the other thing, I mean, I think in there's this very basic term in film theory that every first-year film studies student learns. It's suspension of disbelief, right? Like, you look at the screen, you suspend your disbelief that it's all make-believe, and you just imagine that it can be possible. And maybe we have to do something similar, you know, like maybe knowing all these practical hurdles that are in front of us that seem to be, you know, very difficult to overcome because we are stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea, that, you know, we imagine what it would be like without that. And as soon as we start imagining it, maybe somehow the practical steps can come too. But I think the first thing that we need to do, and which we are doing right here, is thinking of that world where we are not stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea, and we exist on our own terms.
Okay, I can try to say something. Coming from academia, I don't have many hopes for academic world in that sense, because I mean, it's increasingly depending on also external funding, and this external funding is very instrumental, very pragmatic. I mean, still there are some small places and people who try to outsmart the system and apply for money and then use it differently, or as my older colleague Nina Lykke, Danish feminist, says, it's a hit and run technique. You apply for a grant and then you use it for something decolonial, but yeah. But it's increasingly difficult. And increasingly you see that this decolonizing problematic or decolonial problematic is pushed away. And people, for example, in Sweden, I was watching this, how it was, you know, evolving in the last years. You can get a grant and money of any kind that you study robots, artificial intelligence, all of these things for the wonderful future that somehow they still believe will come. Which is under big question now, right, for everybody in Europe. But no, nothing decolonial and nothing related to what's happening now with people dying en masse, you know, countries being destroyed now. But at the same time, I see, for example, in the Caucasus, there are some, you know, examples of grassroots activism. When people on a local level, on a level of communities, they want to do something, you know, like, for example, in my native Circassians, they did recently an educational initiative for children so that they could learn their native language and also get acquainted with the crafts and with the kind of arts that people were doing traditionally in this area. And it's all organized by people themselves. It's not a lot of money that they got from anywhere. Some maybe local people who can afford also to, and unfortunately, yeah, very often it starts like that. But if you have a large-scale project, I can understand that it's impossible. And then there is always this, unfortunately, you know, danger that there's a lot of money, private money, where it comes from, what kind of money is that? So you have to be very careful, as we know, about this. But at the same time, I agree with Misho. It starts here. It starts with the way we feel and how we decide we want to change the world and build an alternative. because no matter what, nobody can kind of, at this point at least, police how we think and how we come up, how our imagination works, artistic imagination works. So I hope that at least at that level it can work. But there are no recipes, unfortunately. No.
I'm afraid that the war in Ukraine is a very uncomfortable war, because all the decolonial thinking which questions the power of the West or the global North elsewhere, it's still elsewhere. And the war in Ukraine is not elsewhere, it's here. Politically, geographically, culturally, it's here. And on one hand, it shows that it might not have been there if the powers of the global West did not dance around Russia for such a long time and trying to read Putin's mind and whatever, not to exclude, not to. But on the other hand, also shows a huge need for decolonization from inside, because I mean, Russia has to start decolonizing itself. You know, Ukraine is going through this process now, but the third part of this triangle is, you know, this very general but still global West, and this is a very painful and unwanted procedure, because it means deconstructing or rethinking major power structures and major knowledge systems and systems of representation and everything basically. But in this sense, maybe, I don't know, answering to your question a bit, I don't think it's wrong to show to those who hold the power that they do it and they have responsibility, not just because they didn't do something, whatever, 5, 10, 8 years ago or 30 years ago, but because they still hold it now. And the part of that responsibility is to listen and to, you know, to share, to give to those who need it. And on our side, I think very necessary series of steps that we're doing it a bit, but maybe not enough, is precisely this building solidarities and connections within the regions with colleagues that not only to the, you know, from the former post-Soviet space to, you know, Georgia and Armenia and Central Asia, which we don't have enough, but also within Eastern Europe, which is also not enough, with Poland, with Baltic states, and so on. And from this network of solidarity also speak with the stronger voices, with a stronger position, and also with a demand. And I think that, yeah, just saying aside and saying like, well, no, we will somehow manage. No, we will not manage. We need solidarity on one side, and we need stronger position, and also very banal money investment support from the other side. And then we stand a chance.
Something to add, because we are discussing the kind of the how, but on a very practical question, it's again something I've shared with you before, thinking about the why and the importance, what you're saying just reminded me. I live in the Netherlands, and a few years before the full-scale invasion, through the Populist Party, which obviously has Russian support, which is finally obvious to the Dutch now, they held this kind of a referendum, right? They held a referendum on whether or not the Netherlands should allow the association of Ukraine with the European Union. And the result of the referendum was an overwhelming no, because most of the people who voted had a formed position. But I often think, or at least speculate, on whether or not the fact that in the Western, you know, like one can go to a museum in the Netherlands and see Ukrainian artwork, except it's going to say that it's Russian, right? So because these cultures are so homogenized, and because this identity is so missing from the public view, I wonder if it wasn't so, if Ukraine was really visible as kind of its own separate, strong culture, like they see the rest of European cultures, would they have voted the same way? You know, I mean, would more people turned up to vote and vote for the association of Ukraine? So, you know, I mean, sometimes I think one might feel kind of isolated in the art bubble, and think that these things don't have an influence on this kind of like realpolitik that happens, but they do. It really does, and yeah. So I think that's it.
Well, this is what we believe in the Ukrainian Institute, because what we do is actually creating the visibility for Ukrainian culture, so it has the agency, and it kind of shares this agency with the state, the nation, and in the good sense of way, because of course, you know, we know how art can become a special operation, as the director of the Hermitage said in his sadly famous interview. So of course, you know, and this is going to be a topic of our next program in October, actually, how art can be misused as a weapon also, yeah, but it can also serve as a bridge and a kind of give help and visibility. And as I'm representing an institution, I will allow myself also to answer my own question, is how we kind of try to find these ways to bring this visibility to Ukraine. And so first of all, of course, we need to make aware everyone that this is what actually is our situation, and make the world understand that even if not all the features of colony you can find in Ukraine in relation to Russia, but it was still a colonial relationship, and we suffered from the same kind of traumas and problems, and we need to overcome this. And this is why we are creating forums like this, for example, this conversation where we can speak with representatives of the region, of the global West, South, all parts of the world, and make our voice heard. And from the first conversation that happened on the same stage in April, I have to tell you, a huge difference happens. I mean, the number of texts, the number of conversation, the response and visibility of this topic has risen to, you know, to a large amount. Of course, there is still a lot of work to do, obviously, but I mean, at least we opened up this conversation, and it's running. It's not kind of disappearing between the other things and issues. So it's just the communication, the conversation about it. And also when we are working with our partners, with other institutions, museums, festivals, etc., we appreciate the immediate response, the emergency response that Ukraine received in the first month after the invasion. All these pop-up things like Support Ukraine, Stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, etc., that happen everywhere, I think, on the globe, you know, along with like light in the buildings in blue and yellow colors. But it would be a great disappointment if these one-off emergency things would be everything that was done. And it is actually a matter of all our conversations now with partners. Like, if you already let Ukraine in, and you know we're not behind your doors anymore, which happened for decades before. I mean, don't throw us out. Just leave us in the program. You know, when you're programming your next year, just find a place for Ukrainian play, music, theater, author, poet, whatever. You know, translate one book in your publishing houses from Ukrainian. Like, do something in some kind of scope that will make Ukraine visible. And I would tell you that this obvious idea doesn't come to people's minds. And this is how this epistemology works, you know. People are not used to thinking that Ukraine is in their horizon of planning. You know, they just don't have this idea of cooperating. And you literally have to put this idea in their mind, like literally telling what may be a possibility, just like plan something to do within the next year. Very simple, but it doesn't seem obvious to everyone. And I just, I just want us to kind of keep this idea. So it should be even spoken about, in a very literal and very straightforward way. I think we still have a little bit of time for a question or two. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and Maria will bring a microphone, so please don't speak before you have a mic, because we won't hear you. Anyone? No, last chance, okay. Then maybe there's a question, okay.
Thank you. As an Italian, I would like to know more about your feeling towards the Soviet Union legacy. I remember the first time I was in Moscow, it was 1986, and I had the chance to meet Ilya Kabakov in his studio. The Soviet Union was still there, and I mean, as an Italian, to me, to be Russian or to be from the Soviet Union was more or less the same. I was young and not so sophisticated. And he told me, listen, I'm not from Russia. I'm from Soviet Union. I should tell you that I am from Kiev. I mean, he was born nearby Kiev. But I don't feel myself as Ukrainian. I feel myself as somebody who was born in the Soviet Union and will die in the Soviet Union. He will not die in the Soviet Union. He will die in the States. But, you know, history sometimes came as a surprise. So somehow he felt he was part of a certain circulation of ideas within the Soviet Union, like an entity, a cultural entity that doesn't exist anymore. So what are your feelings about this entity that lasted till 30 years ago, but to us, to the majority of the world, I would say, still does exist in let's say, mental terms. So, of course, we all know, if we are here, that Russia and Ukraine are two different places. But Soviet Union did exist. We cannot imagine a 20th century without that presence. So what is your, the place you give Soviet Union in your own identity as people from Ukraine?
May I? Yeah, I'm not from Ukraine. I'll answer this as a Georgian. And before the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Russian Empire, which already stole our independence from us once, there was the Georgian Democratic Republic, which was the first social democratic republic in the world that was then occupied by the Soviet Union. So if there is a past that I identify with, it's a stolen past. It's a past that was taken away from under our feet, and it took away a future from under our feet. A lot of the kind of the ideas of the Georgian Democratic Republic, which was the first elected social democratic republic in the world, are now being, implemented in Nordic countries like mixed economies, etc. Ideas about equality. So I don't know if I can really have any kind of feelings about the Soviet Union did exist, and it's something that I think Western people need to realize, to not only look at us through that lens, actually, that only because this is something that we encounter very, very often, I think, every time, that we are only looked at through the lens of recent history and an imposed history on us. You know, it's one doesn't really ask Algerians what they think of, like, the French Empire, right? Because it's not an ethical question. It's not an ethical question because it implies that one is only tied to a very particular kind of past. And yeah, and an occupied past. And maybe that's some of the work that we have to do, because I think we know each other to be more than this single occupation. And we can recognize each other for more than that. So, you know, I mean, I have my feelings about the Soviet Union, I have my feelings about Soviet Georgia. I think they're complex, you know, they're not black and white, as one might imagine. But I think that this lens has to change.
As much as I respect Kabakov and his work, and he was not born anywhere near Kiev, he was born quite some kilometers away in Dnipro. Maybe that's also a bit about mental geography of Ukraine. But, you know, he reminds me a bit of the crocodile, the alligator from the film we just saw. Yeah, well, the time changed, and if he actually doesn't accept the change, he will get depressed and die. Just because the time changed. And maybe the part of the trick with Kabakov, but not only with Kabakov, unfortunately, or I mean, that's just how it is that, you know, being a Soviet artist it was sexy. And being just post-Soviet artist was also sexy for Western institutions. And someone who is much younger than him, but Victoria Lamasco, for example, you know, she built her whole identity and her whole cultural capital of being the last Soviet artist. And now it crumbles into pieces with her position and on what she does. So, yeah, get depressed and die.
Well, I mean, I can't agree more. I was listening to you and thinking like, yeah, why do we still have to deal with this question? It's a very colonial way of looking at us also in some ways, right? Like, again, homogenizing, no matter what we say and how different we are, and we do some cultural work on that, but we are still kind of lumped together, right? So it's our destiny. And I mean, I have a trickster attitude to that, because having spent several decades in post-Soviet Russia, I was always, and am always, racialized there because I'm not Russian ethnically, so I'm seen as a black coming from the Caucasus, right? And stopped by the police for not having blue eyes, you know, in metro and all that. But it's interesting that then when I cross the border and I come to Europe, I start automatically to be seen as Russian, right? Because, again, they don't see these differences, they don't see these nuances, and they, again, put you into a certain category, and that, I think, needs to change. And there's a lot of work. And as you said, we start this work, we do this, we offer knowledge, we're open to other people, but they also need to make an effort. They need to change this sort of way of looking at people and at things.
And maybe just like one thing I would like to say in response to that is there are people who think that they are still Soviet Union, even in, you know, each of our countries. And I mean, what can you do with someone else's mind if people believe they are there? I mean, some people still believe they are in medieval times. Some live literally in the future, and they are kind of 100 years ahead of everyone else. And this is how temporality works, you know, it's individual. We are not all supposed to be having like the same type of consciousness, because we all have different backgrounds, different knowledge, different experience, different cognitive cognitive experiences. So, I mean, yeah, there are some people who think that Soviet republic still exists. Sergei Loznitsa, for example, holding the Ukrainian passport and kind of representing himself as a Ukrainian artist is a Soviet person. I mean, and all the narratives that he is producing are very Soviet. But what can we do with that? I mean, that's his choice. He chooses to stay behind in the Soviet times. Well, yeah, okay. Get depressed and die, yeah. Sorry. Thank you, wonderful question. We have what to say about it. Thank you so much. That was a very fruitful morning, and I think we kind of have the feeling on how decoloniality goes. It actually never arrives anywhere, but it's just the process of going somewhere, which is good. And it's very nice to have this feeling of movement and not being kind of stuck at some place and being attached to something, that kind of holds you and doesn't allow you to move. And we will also move on now. We will have a break after this discussion, a break for some air and lunch. And we will be back here at 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock Central European Summer Time. So all who are in Venice, please return by that time, which we will have to start exactly at 3 o'clock because we will have a screening of the film, and right after that screening we will begin another discussion dedicated to institutional work and decoloniality, and that will be the final discussion for today, but we will still have the day tomorrow, as interesting as today's and yesterday's. So please stay with us and have a good rest.